begin the program. We just have a little bit of a thing we have to tweak. Sandra Stosky has been at a different city every single day for the last 2 weeks in California. She didn't quite write this on her calendar because she was away, so we are going to Skype her. She's willing to, we're going to Skype her. She'll talk to us through the computer. So it'll be kind of interesting. This will be our first like high-level technological forum that we put on. So we're very excited about moving in the 21st century. Okay. I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. Tonight's forum is about Common Core. This is not a political forum. This is a factual, informational forum. I'll moderate the event tonight. My name is Donna Colorio. I've been an educator for the past 22 years, and I've served on the Worcester School Committee from 2011 to 2013. I am a mother of 3. My youngest daughter is a junior at a Worcester Public School, and I've been an adjunct professor at Quinsigamond Community College, and I teach sociology and psychology. Presently, I am the founder of a statewide parent-led group called the Common Core Forum. You might see some literature back there. This organization is dedicated to enlightening the public about the proposed Common Core state standards. We are a statewide, all-volunteer, nonpartisan organization that does not accept any donations, so we are not backed by anybody. We just are parents and teachers that are here to educate you. Common Core Forum's goal is to keep Massachusetts public schools #1, and we do this by educating the parents, school committees, school administrators, and legislators. We believe in local control of public education, high academic standards, and a maximum parental input. Our members strongly believe that implementing Common Core will lower student achievement and threaten the considerable gains Massachusetts has made since ed reform. Our group is made up of about 2,000 volunteers throughout the state. Our greatest accomplishment thus far has been to serve as a resource to educate the public about Common Core. We have done this through social media, letters to the editor, informational forums, sponsoring events by nationally recognized experts, publishing timely and pertinent literature, organizing opt-out movements, communicating with local and state elected officials, and participating in rallies and working with our state legislators to file bills to eradicate Common Core in Park. Tonight you'll hear from one physical expert and another computer expert. We'll have Sandra Stosky. So my first speaker is Jamie Gass. Jamie is a Pioneer Institute Director of the Center of School Reform. At Pioneer, he has framed, commissioned, and managed over 60 research papers and numerous policy events on K-12 education reform topics. Jamie has more than 2 decades of experience in public administration and education reform at the state, municipal, and school district levels. He has appeared on various Boston media outlets as well as talk radio across the country. He has been quoted in The Economist, Educational Week, the Boston Globe. And his op-eds are regularly published in the Boston Herald, the Worcester Telegram and Gazette, the Lowell Sun, the Providence Journal, and other regional newspapers, as well as national op-ed in magazine articles in the Wall Street Journal, Education Next, and the City Journal. Jamie speaks on academic standards, school choice options, and school accountability at events throughout the country. And trust me, Jamie is all over the country. We were just in Maine a couple of weeks ago speaking at a full-day event. Please welcome Jamie Gass.
Thanks so much, Donna, and I want to thank the moms who set up the event and all of you for coming out on a pretty cold night to listen to what I think is an interesting topic that has an enormous impact on the lives of our children and our schools and our communities. So My name is Jamie Gass. I'm director of the Center for Schoolroom Pioneer Institute. It's a Boston-based think tank, so we are a research organization that's been around for about 20 years or so. We are completely nonpartisan and independent. We accepted no money on behalf of any large foundation or large donor to do the work that we've done on Common Core and the research we've done on Common Core. And we are known pretty much for doing data-driven, independently peer-reviewed research, and are really known for kind of calling it like we see it. So I guess I'll begin by giving you just a little bit about what Common Core is, because the fact is that even though Massachusetts adopted Common Core over 4 years ago, the reality of it is that most state legislators, many parents, both in Massachusetts and across the country, really don't have any idea what it is or what the impact it's going to have on our schools. But Common Core is a set of English and math standards, these are national English and math standards, that were developed by the National Governors Association, which is a Washington, D.C. based lobbying group on behalf of governors. They don't represent states, they represent governors. And the Council of Chief State School Officers, which is the Washington, D.C. based lobby group for each commissioner of education for each of the states. Again, these are trade organizations that don't represent states, they represent their membership, which are governors and commissioners of education. Most of the funding for Common Core is come from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. You folks all know who Bill Gates is. He was the founder of Microsoft. Well, he has a $40 billion foundation, and he has spent over $200 million funding the CCSSO and the Governors Association and a whole bunch of trade groups around education in order to develop and advocate and lobby for Common Core and its implementation. Common Core is matched with a set of national tests. There's the Smarter Balance Testing Consortia, which has 20 some odd states in it, and then Massachusetts is in the PARC testing consortia. These two national testing consortia will replace the state level tests. We know the state level test as the MCAS test. The PARC test, if it continues on the same trajectory, will replace MCAS over the next year or so. So there's a quote here that I want to pull up on my phone to kind of start my kind of more formal remarks. So I'm going to start off with this quote from someone who knew a lot more about the nature of our republic and our Constitution than I ever will. And it's James Madison. He wrote the Bill of Rights, he drafted the Constitution, he's called the father of the Constitution, and this is what he wrote in 1792. If Congress may establish teachers in every state, county, and parish, and pay them out of the public treasury, they may take into their hands the education of children, establishing in like manner schools throughout the Union. I would venture to declare it as my opinion. It would subvert the very foundation and transmute the very nature of limited government established by the people of America. And again, this is James Madison in 1792. I think the Founding Fathers were very wise. They understood that the national government has particular roles and responsibilities and jurisdictions, trade and foreign policy and defense, but that most of the domestic issues that most directly impact the lives of citizens and school children in particular, and schooling, are really the proper legal jurisdictions of states and localities. Even after about 50 years of a sort of steady growth in the federal government having a role in K-12 education, 90% of the funding of K-12 education comes from the state and local level. That is to say, state and local taxpayers pay for it, and by law, by state constitutions, the states and localities are the ones that are really responsible for it. The federal government has a very small role to play. And I'd argue that this arrangement of the federal government doing the things that it's supposed to do and the states and localities doing the things that they're supposed to do has actually served this country quite well. Essentially, in the last 200 years, we've gone from a small collection of colonies along the eastern seaboard to the most powerful country in the world. And commentators for several hundred years have commented about how unique this country is, that unlike Europe, where kings and queens and czars and ministers and sort of bureaucrats at the top of government dictate things. That what is unique about this country and what's unique about our Constitution or our way of life is that citizens at the local level are the ones that oftentimes where the ideas come that govern our society. They're the ones that pay for our schools and pay for a lot of the services that are most connected with their lives. And this is really, really unique. And this, again, this arrangement has served us really well. I mean, but till, a little bit after World War II, we began to notice a steady decline in the quality of public education in this country. The first thing that sort of got everyone's attention was in the late 50s. There's a program called Sputnik. It was the Soviet Union had put this, space device up in the air, and everyone was alarmed. We've got to do something to improve the quality of math and science in order to compete. And then by the early 1980s, there was a report called A Nation at Risk, which was authored by the Reagan administration that said that the country had basically fallen out of its competitive advantage among the highest performing countries in the world, that we were somewhere between 11th and 17th in terms of our ability to compete in the area of math and science with all the highly technological and industrialized countries in the world, Germany and Japan, and et cetera. But what that Nation at Risk report did not do was come up with lots of top-down solutions from Washington, D.C. about how to fix this problem. Because whether people were Republicans or Democrats or liberals or conservatives, everybody knew that the schooling was the proper jurisdiction and legal authority and financial authority of states and localities. That these fixes had to come from the people that were paying for it, that had the legal authority over it, and frankly had a better understanding of what students' needs were. I mean, parents and teachers and principals, these are the people that should be making the decisions that are intimately connected with the lives of children. And so gradually through the 80s and even into the 90s, there were lots of different solutions about how to solve this problem. Well, what happened is that there was these Washington, D.C.-based trade organizations, the Governors Association, the Council of Chief State School Officers, some of the teachers' unions. They all began to get together and said, what we really need to have in order to compete are a set of national standards, national testing, a national curriculum, and lots of sort of centralized data so that all the centralized decision makers can decide how it should be fixed. And other folks came with other ideas. They said, the way to fix this is inject more school choice into it, so give parents more choices, private schools, parochial schools, vocational technical schools, that the parental choice will create competition, and that competition will force the lower performing schools and districts to improve. What Massachusetts did was really quite different. In 1993, we're really fortunate. We had a Republican governor named Bill Weld, and he worked with Tom Birmingham, who was a pretty liberal Democrat and a labor lawyer, and Mark Roosevelt, who's the great-grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, who's also a Democrat with a great relationship with organized labor. And these folks of both political parties sat down and crafted the 1993 Education Reform Act. And what the 1993 Education Reform Act was both good politics and it was good policy. What they decided to do was add in an enormous amount of state and a minimum level of local funding in K-12 education. And over the last 20 years, we've spent over $100 billion in the state and local level for ed reform, in exchange for all the tough things that, frankly, a lot of people in public education had not wanted to do over the previous several decades, and that I think had led to a lot of the decline that both Massachusetts had experienced, but that the country had experienced. Specifically, there was going to be a high-stakes test to graduate from high school, and we all know that as the MCAS test. But it wasn't just a test, it was a set of really high-quality academic standards. If technology allows for it, later you'll hear from Sandy Stotsky. She was the architect of the English, math, science, and history standards that were aligned to the MCAS. Those standards were also aligned to the teacher testing. So the idea was there's going to be a test for students, there's going to be a test for teachers, and they're all going to be tested on the same material. The expectations for the adults and the students were going to be high. They're going to be focusing on academics. It wasn't going to be soft skills, it wasn't going to be fuzzy math, there wasn't going to be lots of sort of self-esteem efforts. It was going to be English, math, science, and history. In English, it was going to be Huckleberry Finn and Sherlock Holmes and Charles Dickens and high-quality literature, poetry, drama, because as it turns out, the quality of the vocabulary and the sentences and the language in that classic literature, poetry, and drama is better quality than the often nonfiction or what they call informational texts or sort of skills-based approaches that had been kind of populating education reform for previous decades. So Massachusetts was going to go in a different direction and kind of be back to basis in English. They were going to do the exact same thing in mathematics. The architects of the standards in Massachusetts looked at all the high-performing countries, South Korea and Hong Kong and Singapore and Japan, all the countries that that Nation at Risk report in the early 80s said, you've got to compete with these countries to compete in the 21st century. Well, they looked at what those high standards, high-performing countries were doing in the area of math and science, and they found out that you have to have access to Algebra 1 in the 8th grade. That allows kids to have the proper progression so that if you want to be a scientist or a mathematician or an engineer or work in the technical fields, you'll be able to get to pre-calculus, calculus, and trigonometry. You have to start Algebra 1 early. It's the gateway for all higher level mathematics. And 15,000 pieces of research makes it clear that Algebra 1 is the key. And so what Massachusetts did, and one other state did it too, California did it in the 90s, we made sure that our standards had access to Algebra 1 in the 8th grade. We had a more traditional approach to geometry. We had high quality Algebra 2, and in the standards there were pre-calculus, calculus, trigonometry. So while they weren't testing that, there's a pathway to those, what they call the STEM fields. And this grand bargain of an enormous amount of money for high academic standards and testing and accountability for everybody in the entire system has been historically successful. The fact is that there are really two conversations going on in this country right now in K-12 education. There's all the things that Massachusetts has done over the last 20 years, which has led to remarkable results, which I'll tell you about in a minute. And then there's the rest of the country, which is stuck in various degrees of stagnation and decline. They are much of the country is still in the area where that the Nation at Risk report outlined in 1983. There's been some incremental improvements here and there, but generally speaking, it's a kind of flatline performance nationally. That's not true in Massachusetts. So there's a test that's called the NAEP test. It's the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's the nation's report card. Every state takes it. They take it every 2 years. It's been around for about 40 years. No state in the history of that test has ever been #1 in every grade tested and every category tested. And in 2005, Massachusetts was the first state in the union to accomplish that remarkable feat. And then we did it again in 2007, in 2009, 2011, and 2013. I say that it's like winning the World Series 5 times in a row and doing it in 4 straight games each time. It is a remarkable, remarkable accomplishment. The teachers, the parents, the principals, the superintendents, the school committee members, the lawmakers, the taxpayers. This is an enormous, enormous accomplishment that all these people paid for and worked hard to do. I mean, but as I mentioned, in the 1983 Nation at Risk report, the goal of education reform is not just to compete with Arkansas and Mississippi and a bunch of low-performing states within the United States. To compete in the 21st century, you've got to compete with all the high-performing, high-standards countries. So in 2007, Massachusetts tested as its own individual country. It was one of only 2 states in the union to sign up for a test called TIMSS, which is the gold standard of international math and science testing. Minnesota was the other state. And guess what? Massachusetts 8th graders were tied for #1 in the world in science. A remarkable, remarkable accomplishment. And then in the area of mathematics, we were within the top 4 in the world in mathematics, in both in 4th and 8th grade. Again, remarkable accomplishment, exceeding the wildest expectations and hopes of people like Bill Weld and Tom Birmingham and Mark Roosevelt, the Republicans and Democrats that got together in 1983 and crafted this big Ed Reform Act. No one could have ever believed it. I mean, I say that the success on the international math and science is like winning a couple of Olympic gold medals. It's that good. So that's sort of the good news. The bad news is that starting in about 2007 or so, a bunch of these Washington, D.C. based trade organizations, the Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers, got together with this Gates Foundation money and said, look, the country's in stagnation and decline in K-12 education. What we need to do to compete is we've got to start pushing for national standards testing and curriculum. And so that's precisely what they began to do. Again, these are private trade organizations. They get public money from the membership dues that the governors and the commissioners pay to them, but they also get a lot of corporate money, and they're private organizations. So if you want to do a Freedom of Information Act search to find out what was the decision making on who was going to be hired to work on the standards, how much they were going to be paid, all of the kind of issues of accountability and transparency that you hope for with the public, they're not really subject to that. So you can't find out that information. Pioneer has tried. You can't. There's a thing called the Freedom of Information Act search. You can't do that to the Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers. And then what happened is that in 2009, the federal government and the Obama administration and the U.S. Department of Education initiated a grant program called the Race to the Top. Now, here in Massachusetts, with some degree of pride, we could say we're already at the top. It was really the race to be Massachusetts, right? And so, as they began to develop the national standards, Pioneer Institute, where I work, we are independent researchers. Massachusetts had the most to lose in this discussion about national standards. So we said, look, someone's got to look at the academic quality. Is it as good as what Massachusetts and high standard states have already had? So we enlisted Sandy Stotsky. She had worked in the department and overseen the development of the Massachusetts standards. She had worked in Indiana. She had worked in a handful of other places on academic standards. Even the advocates of national standards had previously used Sandy to evaluate all the states in terms of academic quality in standards, right? We got Sandy and we coupled her together, and she's an expert really in reading, in English language arts and reading, right? We coupled her together with a guy named Jim Milgram, who's a professor of mathematics at Stanford University. He is both an internationally renowned mathematician at Stanford, but he's also unique in the sense that he is a guy who actually cares about K-12 education. A lot of mathematicians in higher education are focused on their research. They don't devote a lot of energy to K-12 education and how schools are going to improve. Professor Milgram is one of the unique mathematicians in the country, and frankly the world, that worked on the very high-quality California math standards. So we coupled them together, and we got another guy named Zeb Werman. He's a Silicon Valley engineer. He too had worked on the California math standards. So we got the best independent academic experts that we could find. And what they did is they looked at every draft of Common Core, and there were 4 drafts that they developed of Common Core leading up to the final draft. And they generated them in about 6 months. And the Massachusetts standards, frankly, took years of debate and input and public hearings and conversations and redrafting and starting all over again. But the Common Core, they really developed within 6 months. And so Sandy and Jim Milgram and others worked on these 50-page evaluations, crosswalking the Common Core standards in English math against high standard states like Massachusetts and California and Indiana and Texas and Minnesota. And what did they find in these exhaustive independent analysis? They found the Common Core in both English and math was significantly lower quality than in English and math than what high standard states already had. So it was not going to be a race to the top for Massachusetts. It was going to be more like a race to the middle if we adopted. Specifically, they ignored the evidence from Massachusetts in English language arts. The key to our success had, as I mentioned earlier, this deep commitment to classic literature, poetry, and drama. The literature and poetry and drama, it matters because when children are learning about characters and they're learning about plot and all of the things that make up stories. Not only is the vocabulary better and the language better, but these are the things that make us human. They bind children and human beings together. They help generate the kind of citizens and students and people that you want to have as your neighbors, that you want voting. They have a sense of empathy and compassion. They have a sense of friendship. These are what children learn from stories. It's what human beings learn from stories. There's a guy who wrote a book a couple years ago called The Storytelling Animal. Human beings are the storytelling animal, right? What did they do in Common Core? They ignored the evidence from Massachusetts, and they ignored the evidence from frankly, a lot of international studies too, and they decided to cut classic literature, poetry, and drama by about 60%, and replaced it with what they call informational text. So what they're trying to do is they're basically trying to dump little bits and pieces of history into English class. So English teachers who, generally speaking, like teaching literature, are now going to be required to teach history, which is not really their, not really their expertise. So there's things like the Gettysburg Address. That's really great. I think all of us can agree. Kids should know the Gettysburg Address. The problem is they're supposed to forget. They call this cold reading. And under Common Core, you're supposed to forget that it happens in the Civil War. You're supposed to forget that President Lincoln is consecrating a cemetery. But then there's also a lot of other junk that they've piled into Common Core, things like, it's really exciting stuff like Federal Reserve manuals and EPA regulations. These are supposedly more practical things that our kids are going to learn about, kind of workforce and practical matters through this informational text. In the area of mathematics, under Common Core, it turns out that they ignored the evidence from Massachusetts and California and all the high standards, high-performing countries, and decided to push access to Algebra 1, which is the key for all high-level math. They decided to push it forward not to just the 9th grade, but to early 10th grade, too. So in terms of our international competitiveness, our students are going to be a grade or perhaps 2 behind in terms of access to the STEM fields. They also, Common Core, they use an experimental form of geometry that's never been successful in any place they've tried it. And it really stops at what they call Algebra 2 Light, which is to say, if you want to go on to pre-calculus, calculus, and trigonometry, and your child wants to be in the STEM fields, well, Common Core is really kind of a path to nowhere, right? So that's the academic quality, and that's first and foremost really important, because when you're talking about academic standards, the quality of it is key, right? The next piece that we looked at in the research was the legality of it, because as I mentioned at the beginning, K-12 education is the proper legal jurisdiction of the states and localities. People across the political spectrum have always known that there are limits on what the federal government can do regarding K-12 education. So we looked at the legal issues. We enlisted the former general counsel and deputy general counsel at the U.S. Department of Education under the second Bush administration. So the 2 highest ranking lawyers in the federal government looked at the legal dimensions of Common Core. And what did they find? They found that there are actually 3 federal laws that explicitly prohibits the federal government from funding or directing or validating or encouraging national standards testing and curriculum. And those 3 federal laws are the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which was signed by Lyndon Johnson, the General Education Provision Act of 1970, which was signed by Richard Nixon, and then there's the enabling legislation that set up the U.S. Department of Education itself, which was signed by President Carter in 1979. So 2 of the 3 laws that prohibit the federal government from doing what it is that they've done through pushing national standards and national testing, 2 of the 3 laws were signed by Democratic presidents. So this is not something that's a partisan issue. It's not something that's a Tea Party issue. It's not a Republican issue. This is a rule of law issue. And it's not just the lawyers that we looked at. I gave you a copy of a column that George Will, the syndicated columnist, did, and he's done 2 of them in the last several years. One of them citing our research, another one drawn heavily from our research that maps out and says, look, the U.S. Department of Education is pretending that there are laws that don't prohibit them from doing what it is they're doing with Common Core and the national testing. They're just brushing these things aside. So, and this is enormously important because the fact is that at a minimum, what K-12 education is supposed to be about in this country, why it was set up by the founding fathers, it's why it was advocated, over the years, was that it was supposed to serve as a wellspring to educate kids about the functioning of our democracy and how to be citizens. So if the adults that are driving this conversation and that are making the rules around K-12 education are violating the law, that's not such a good civics lesson, right? The next piece that we looked at was the cost, because even though U.S. Department of Education has been advocating for this, even though the Gates Foundation has $40 billion and has spent over $200 million developing the standards and advocating for the standards, the fact is that very few, if any, of the governors and legislatures across the country and budget offices across the country, very few of them actually did a cost analysis of what it's going to cost for the states and localities to implement Common Core. I mean, they figure that it's somebody else's responsibility to pay for it. They're going to just, I mean, it's sort of the equivalent of, you buy a house, and then your next door neighbor gets to tell you what you're going to, what color you're going to paint it, what kind of shrubs you're going to have in front of it, how you're going to decorate it. I mean, all the key decisions that makes the house a home gets picked, determined by somebody else. But you got to pay for it. You got to pay for the mortgage, right? That's really what we're talking about. So we enlisted a guy who had been working in both for Republicans and Democrats at the U.S. Department of Education. He worked in the first Bush administration and the first administration of President Clinton, so he worked for Republicans and Democrats. He had experience both on Capitol Hill, on federal funding, but he'd also worked in states. And he and his researchers came up with a figure for the implementation of Common Core nationally of about $16 billion. So Massachusetts has spent over $100 billion to be #1 in the country and internationally competitive. We're going to have to, according to the projections that he's done, which I think are actually very baseline projections. I think he did these a couple of years ago, and I think it's actually going to end up being much higher. You're seeing it come in from states, and the projections, I think, were very, very modest. But for Massachusetts, it's going to be about $350 million. Again, this is going to come from the states and localities. It's not going to come from the federal government. They're done. They've gotten people to comply and states to comply, and now the local taxpayers have to adopt, textbooks that are aligned with Common Core. So here in Uxbridge, if in 2010 you bought new textbooks, those textbooks all have to be thrown out because they're not aligned to the Common Core. That's an enormously expensive exercise to go through, right? All the teacher preparation, all of the teacher training, that all has to get redone because these are new standards and they're new tests. But the biggest cost driver is the multi-year technology costs, because a lot of what they want to do is put the testing online. You may already be seeing this where kids are either using or school districts are buying iPads to do the online testing. They've done some piloting in Massachusetts using the iPads, and the whole idea is to move it all online. Sort of the final piece of research that we've looked at, which gets a lot of people's attention, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it. We have done an 80-page paper on it. It's got 400 footnotes, I think. Is on the collection of student-level data. And I'm a father of 2 daughters. One's 7, one's 3, one's in school, one's not. And I just, I'll give you the sort of the long and the short of it. Some of the things that they want to do in terms of collecting data and brush aside student privacy and parental privacy is creepy. It's not, I'm not saying because, we just said Halloween, it's creepy. It's unnecessary collection of personally identifiable data, not just on children, but on families. Because again, the idea behind this is a kind of more centralized kind of workforce development model. They want to be able to have all this information on students and families so that they can really start to track and direct kids to particular careers. That's really the outlook. If you look at the people that developed the PARCC test, Achieve Inc. in Washington, D.C., which was set up by the Governors Association, if you look at the Governors Association, the Council of Chief State School Officers, over 20 plus years, they really are more interested in education, not as a kind of grounding in a liberal arts education in math and science and history to develop citizens. They really want to develop workforce. That's really what they want to do. And they kind of want to be the ones that are kind of picking and choosing or directing where kids are going to go. That's really the outlook here. So I've kind of given you a lot of bad news. The good news is that the more parents, through forums like this, and we've been to 30 some odd states across the country, we've spoken in front of 5 people, and we've spoken in front of 900 people. But the more parents and state legislators and public officials find out about the Common Core, the more they are alarmed by it. Because frankly, it was done with a lot of secrecy. It was done very quickly. It wasn't done with a lot of transparency. And people, generally speaking, didn't know that much about it. But as people are finding out about it, as the research that we've done and that other folks are doing, and all the good forums that Donna and other people are doing in Massachusetts and across New England and across the country, the more people find out about it, they say, there's some problems here. There's some things that should have been vetted. They should have been made known to the people that are going to be impacted by it. And, you know, we're seeing from the beginning, Texas, you know, they did the thing that probably most states, especially Massachusetts, should have done. You know, Texas and the motto is don't mess with Texas. Well, they used the opportunity of Common Core to get Sandy Stotsky, to get Jim Milgram, to get the best experts they could to develop their standards. So they now have the best academic standards in the country. More and more states, Oklahoma, Indiana, North Carolina, South Carolina, Missouri, there's conversations going on in a bunch of states about either repealing the Common Core or revising it or getting out of it, you know, altogether. And that's the good news, is that it's actually enlivened parents to get engaged about what's going to be impacting their kids. I have to say that most of the events we go to, and you know, I'm a father, so I'm not slighting fathers, 70–80% of the people in the audience are moms. This is a mom and grandmother-driven movement, and it is remarkable to watch the way in which folks have gotten themselves educated. They've spent a lot of extra time not only just finding out the details of what this is all about, but all the secondary relationships. I mean, the truth of it, there's a lot of moms across the country that know about the secondary relationships beyond Common Core more than I do, and I've spent the last 4+ years researching it for a living, right? Anyway, I've given you a ton of information. You've been really patient. I know it's a lot of details. It's a lot of information. I'm really grateful for you folks taking the time, again, on a cold night to come out and to listen to us. You're in for a real treat if we are able to get Sandy.
We're working on it. I can go over a few things, though, while we're waiting to see if we can get Sandy.
If we're able to get Sandy, she's great. You know, she's a genuine heroine of the work that we've done here in Massachusetts. She really, there's nobody in the country whose standards have correlated with remarkable gains for kids the way the work that she's done. So if you're able to hear from her, it's really a real treat. So again, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
We're just trying to get Sandy on Skype. She's having technical difficulties. So as we're waiting, I just wanted to go over a few things. Some of the handouts that I want you to be aware of that we have done is that Sandy put together, this one that you got here, it says flaws. I'm a teacher, so I want to show you visual handouts. I want you to all know that we have handouts. The first one is flaws in Common Core language and literacy standards. Sandy put this together so you could see the difference between Common Core and the Massachusetts standards. This second one is by James Milgram, the missing and delayed in Common Core Massachusetts standards. He just put that together. These aren't even, I don't even know if these are up on Sandy's website. They're so new. She just brought them, I think it was two times before. So this is very, very new. Also here you have the letter from the Commissioner of Education, Commissioner Chester. This letter is really important because when a lot of, how many here are from Uxbridge, the town of Uxbridge? So majority of you are. What other towns are you from?
Douglas.
Douglas. Okay, so is anybody here doing the park pilot? Oh, the second year park. Okay, so the park, if you choose to refuse the test for your child, Commissioner Chester has very clearly stated that on the front page he says you can't opt out, and the second page he says if you choose to refuse. So it is a matter of wording, okay? So you can refuse your child not to take the test with no repercussions. You shouldn't have any problem with your superintendent, nor should you have any problem with your administrators, because it is your right as a parent to refuse the test. So if you do, you know, you have this letter of authenticity from the commissioner. Another one, we have a couple informational, what's Why are you concerned about Common Core? And this was put out by the Massachusetts Teachers and Parents United. It's the breakdown of how the difference between the MCAS testing and the PARCC testing and how many hours it takes, because it does take longer for the PARCC testing. And that might be something that you might want to use to challenge your administrators when they say that the PARCC test won't be as long. You can use that as an outline. And then you have Sandra Stosky's, another one is her fact sheet on the Common Core developers, writers, and validation committees. Some of the myths about it. This is really an important document because it lists, remember, Sandra Stosky was there at the validation time. When they got together to say yay or nay on Common Core, she was there to rubber stamp it. She was right in that room with everybody else. She was the one that was to look over the English language arts, and she refused to sign off to it. So she has, that's very important. And I think that's the last one that I gave, and then Jamie gave some other information. Ladies, do we have any progress going on back there? What? It's failing. Okay.
She said can you do a conference call? She said.
Okay.
She said she can't hear her Skype. She said.
So,
She's on speaker right now.
I'm on the speakerphone.
Yep.
okay, I have the microphone to you right now, Sandy. So,
I'm sorry.
I
Say
have,
that again.
I have the microphone to the phone, so you're in front of a crowd right now, so, you know,
I can begin speaking.
you
Yeah.
can, yes, okay. You want to speak for about 15 minutes?
I will do so right now.
Okay, thank you.
All right. I'll be happy to talk for about 15 minutes. I'm sorry I can't see the audience, but I will tell you about, first, the 4 major audiences that were excluded from the development of Common Core standards. The first major audience excluded were parents themselves. Not that the parents should have been developing the standards, but they should have been one of the major response groups to those who were developing the standards. The second group excluded were people who should have been helping to develop the standards, and they were teachers. There were no high school math teachers on any of the 3 major groups established by the Common Core project, and there were no English teachers on these groups, high school English teachers. There was finally one high school English teacher on the validation committee, only because I complained loudly enough about the absence of a high school English teacher on a committee called validation. And the other 2 groups that were excluded were state legislators who didn't know anything about the Common Core project and were deliberately bypassed, and only a couple of years ago began to ask me and a few others to come and testify to tell them what Common Core's standards were all about, what the project was trying to accomplish, and what was going to happen and what were the costs going to be, because they had not been informed about any of this from their own State Board of Education. We have a very derelict Board of Education in almost every state in the country, so far as I know, also in Massachusetts, but I cannot be sure. I've just heard this in various states. The final group excluded were local school board members or school committee members in Massachusetts. They were informed after their State Board of Education adopted Common Core standards, and then they were simply told that the State Board of Education had adopted new standards for the state. It was either willful or deliberate to keep just about everybody in the dark, particularly when these standards were loaded with policy implications and cost implications. And the 2 major costs, as we now see it at this point, 5 years later, 2 major costs are the cost for the technology infrastructure or the testing, because all the testing is to eventually be online, computer-based, and the other cost is for the enormous ongoing costs of professional development for teachers and administrators, and it will be a cost that will have to be borne almost forever, because Common Core's standards require an approach and ideas that are not familiar to either teachers or administrators, and in many cases they are totally ineffective so far as we have any research information on them. So if you are trying to teach teachers how to teach ineffectively to poorly written standards, you're going to have professional development costs forever in order to get them to try to correct their ways and produce higher student achievement, which will probably never be possible with those standards. Let me go back for a few minutes now to the major groups that were set up so that you can understand what I'm now going to say about the Massachusetts standards in relation to Common Cores, since this is a group of people who are either parents or citizens familiar possibly with the standards we had in this state. You need to know that Common Core began with a group of 24 people who were assigned to what was called a Standards Development Work Group. 12 in English, 12 in math, but most of them were not content experts. Most of them were associated with the testing industry. This should have been the first clue to alert journalists or reporters that there was something peculiar with this project. That was certainly a clue to me. You would not expect college readiness standards, those high school standards that would be used for a test to determine whether students were college ready or not, you would not expect those people to be associated with the testing industry. You would have expected them to be one of two different kinds of people: high school math and English teachers and college teaching faculty in math and English or humanities, who would therefore be in a position to understand and make a determination about what should be considered college readiness. But those two groups of people were absent from the Standards Development Work Group. You then had a group of standards writers, and here was where we really see another agenda at work. There were three lead standards writers for ELA. David Coleman was the lead one. He is now the president of the college boards. He was assisted in the writing of the ELA standards by someone named Susan Pimentel, someone who had been a Head Start teacher, had a degree in elementary education, had no experience in teaching either K through 6, K through 12, or at the college level. A third person, James Patterson, was an official and a staff member of ACT, a testing agency. What he did, we don't know. He disappeared long ago from the limelight, and we've never known exactly what his contribution was, because so-called credit or responsibility for the ELA standards for Common Core was given or assigned always by reporters to David Coleman and Sue Pimentel. Now, neither of them have a degree in English, a major in English. Neither of them, as I said, ever taught in K-12 or above. Neither of them had ever written anything on education. Neither of them, all three of them as a matter of fact, were totally unknown to the field. No one had heard of them in reading or in English, composition, rhetoric, speaking, linguistics, language studies, you name it, nobody knew them. Who chose them? We think they were chosen by the Gates Foundation and Achieve Incorporated, but we really don't know for sure because they have never indicated who chose these people, nor do we have any records we can go to because the whole entire project was shrouded in secrecy. It was a non-transparent project. The goals were obviously political, not educational, and they have remained political and more intensively political as the years have gone along. There has been no acknowledgement that parents or teachers are having extremely unusual problems in implementing these so-called standards, nor do we have any faith that these standards, either in English or in mathematics, will make students college ready. I believe you have 2 pages. One page is by me, called The Flaws in Common Core's ELA standards. The other page, which may be a 1 or 2 pager, by Professor James Milgram from Stanford University. He has prepared 2 pages as a shortened version of a much longer annotated criticism of Common Core's math standards. His pages indicate the missing or delayed standards in mathematics. Professor Milgram was the only mathematician on the validation committee. That was the 3rd major committee formed by Common Core. Its purpose was to validate the standards that were being developed by the lead writers based on the earlier college-ready standards that had been developed and shaped and established by the standards development work group that I mentioned at the beginning. There were about 29 people ultimately on this validation committee. I was the only one who was an English language arts standards expert. Professor Milgram, who is now emeritus at Stanford University, was the only mathematician on this committee. That should alone have told somebody, reporters, the media, others in the field, that there was something peculiar about this committee if they didn't think anything was peculiar about the standards development group, that it did not include high school math and English teachers or teaching faculty at the college level. But here, Professor Milgram and I were on a validation committee for Common Core standards, and we were the only 2, each in our own area, who could literally ensure, if we could, that the standards were 1, internationally benchmarked, 2, rigorous, 3, research-based. We were 2 of the 5 people who refused to sign off on the standards, and these standards have never been validated in the 5 years since they were developed and released in June 2010, and then in the next few months of 2010, adopted by over 45 state boards of education. They have never been validated. They have never been internationally benchmarked, which means they are comparable to the best sets of standards in the highest achieving countries in the world. We know who these countries are because they appear at the top on international tests, and it is very clear what countries we should be compared with and our standards should be compared with. But we have right now in Massachusetts, and I will finish soon after I explain the difference between Common Core's English and math standards and the very first-rate standards we had in Massachusetts, that some of you may have been familiar with if you had children, some of whom were older and have gone through high school programs and have successfully gotten into demanding colleges, or at least into STEM majors, which they will not be able to do from Common Core standards if high school programs are based only on Common Core's math standards. As Professor Milgram indicates, they end with about a weak Algebra 2, which does not mean they will make students college ready for anything except an unselective community college. They will not prepare students for careers in STEM, and by STEM I mean science, technology, engineering, and math. One of the major purposes for Common Core standards several years ago was to expand the STEM pipeline. We've heard that phrase over and over. Instead, Common Core's standards will shrink the STEM pipeline. We do not know who made the decision to change the direction of the standards. We do not know to this date, and Professor Milgram knows the people who wrote the math standards, still cannot find out who decided somewhere not to create a pathway to calculus. The pathway to calculus, whether it's taught in grade 12 or it's taught in college in the freshman year, is the pathway to a STEM major. And if there is no way for students to go from a weak Algebra 2 to a calculus course in either high school or college, they will not easily be able to get into a STEM career unless they spend 1 or 2 more years in college, or they take summer courses or extra courses in high school, which is probably not feasible for most students. But we do not know to this date who made a decision not to have that so-called third pathway to calculus, because that was what was implicit in January of 2010 when a draft came through of Common Core's math standards, and Professor Milgram, being a mathematician, was receiving copies of every single draft, whether they were public drafts or not. And at that point, there was a promise that there would be a third pathway in the standards, and when the final document was released in June, the third pathway had been taken away, the standards had been made easier, and he also notes that there were a lot of mathematical errors as well in these standards. He has been tested in all the states that I testify in. We just completed a speaking tour in Northern and Southern California in the past 2 weeks. Professor Milgram, who, as I mentioned earlier, is retired from Stanford but lives in the Palo Alto area, accompanied me to every one of the 13 or so meetings we attended, talking about the deficiencies in Common Core's mathematics standards. So this is not from me, this is my quoting and citing a mathematician who knows how to read high school math standards. This, of course, becomes one of the chief problems that you have to understand. We had boards of education in this country, most of whom are college-educated and intelligent people, but very few of whom can read a set of high school math or high school English standards to understand what they indicate as far as preparation for college-level work in STEM areas. Why we have this situation, we do not know. But in the past 5 years, the Common Core project has been dropping one shoe after another. There's data mining, collecting of personalized information on students that will come from the tests based on Common Core, not from the standards. There is curriculum and instruction tied to these standards. They are not just standards by themselves. They contain a lot of indications of the kind of pedagogy that is to go with the standard. And in the early grades, which is where many parents, as you may have known or heard, across the country are having a great deal of grief because their children are coming home crying, upset, don't understand why they must produce all 7 ways to get to whatever the answer is to 17 plus 36 or whatever the problem may be. But there is a clear pedagogy built into Common Core that delays and stretches out the teaching of multiple strategies, all of which must be taught and learned before students can move on. So, as Professor Milgram has indicated, because he's familiar with the math standards of high-achieving East Asian countries, he has said that by the time our students in this country get to grade 8, they are about 2 years behind their competitive peers in other countries. And the clearest signal is that Common Core's standards for Algebra 1 cannot be completed until the end of grade 9 or beginning of grade 10, compared with what Massachusetts standards had in the old 2000 mathematics standards document, which was they could complete Algebra 1 in grade 8, which was what our competitive high-achieving countries do with their students in grade 7. So we have adopted a pig in a poke that will lower the academic level of our students by about 2 grades worth before they complete high school. I think I'm going to stop here and allow for questions if that seems appropriate now.
Sandy?
Yeah?
Okay, we have some questions in the audience. I guess we should stand up and then figure out, do you want to take the mic over there? Sure. Jamie, would that be easier? Yeah.
We're gonna have to share the mic, I
We're
think.
gonna have to
so
share the mic, so.
We're gonna ask a question and then either I'm gonna answer it.
The question, okay.
Well, first off, I want to thank you both. Sandy, you as well on the phone for spending. Okay, Sandy, for you on the phone, my name is Paul. I'm an engineer, so I am a STEM person, and I just want to say what you guys are coming out with. This is remarkable information. I have many questions, but my first one, and then I'll hand the mic off to someone else. Something doesn't
Someone will have
compute.
to repeat your question to me because it's not coming through clearly. I'm sorry.
All right, not a problem.
All
We'll
right,
do
Sandy,
that.
I'll repeat it once.
Donna, why don't you step closer to
Bring the
Oh,
phone over.
yeah, that's a good idea. Wait, what can I do? Just go.
Oh, no, just,
That's the speaker.
yeah, step on over if you,
Okay.
maybe Sandy can hear
Give
me.
me directions.
So Sandy, given the Gates Foundation involvement with these standards, something in my mind does not compute. And now, given Bill Gates' background, Ballmer's background, Paul Allen, all those guys out of Microsoft, one thing I'm having a very tough time understanding is how they would adopt or support a curriculum that would push back mathematics development at a high school level. I mean, does anything
I
compute on...
agree that this is puzzling, but no one has asked Gates or his friends in the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, in ExxonMobil, and we're at Hewlett-Packard, wherever. No one has asked them why they support a set of math standards that does not lead to STEM, S-T-E-M. Nobody has asked them. They're not on record anywhere. They appear at no hearings. We do not know. It's a good question. I am not a psychoanalyst, so I can't answer why they support such a dumbed-down kind of set of standards. But here is Professor Milgram speaking everywhere. He is a world-known mathematician, and not one mathematician, by the way, is opposing his criticism. Math educators, on the other hand, who don't know what he's talking about, say they support Common Core, but no mathematician who understands how to read math standards, or an engineer, or a scientist, has in any way said his judgment is wrong. They can look at the topics and they can see what's missing. We do not know why they're missing, nor do we understand what Gates' ideological motive may have been. Whether he can read them himself or not is a different issue. It's not clear he can read math standards, and it's not clear that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce spokesman can read, and the education director at ExxonMobil can't probably read high school math standards either. But there must be some people in the higher ed community who could say, this is a joke, a sad joke on this country. We just don't understand it, but this is where a good part of the parental protest in California is coming from. There are a lot of engineers, as you well know, who are looking at these standards, and they don't understand what's happening.
Next question?
Let me comment. So on the, I think that, to answer your question about why the Gates folks have backed this, I mean, Sandy's right, we don't know for sure, but I think that as I mentioned in my remarks, the sort of the logic of the advocates of national standards is that the rest of the country isn't doing well, that while the standards may not be perfect, that this will improve things and standards in lots and lots of states out there. Even the advocates don't make the claim. They say it's better than most states, which is not,
I'll explain that one.
Yep.
Milgram has made the statement, and it's said over and over again. Most state standards were, if you could say, worth an E, and if you get standards for K through 8 that are now D plus or C minus, that may be better for those states. But this is a general set of standards that applies to all kids, not just the bottom 30%. What he has also said in a report that he published with the Pioneer Institute is why there wasn't a pathway to calculus indicated for the top 30%. Not required for high school graduation, we know that, but at least there, so that high school math departments and superintendents and school systems would know that courses should be made available based on a set of pre-calculus standards and strong Algebra 2 standards for as many kids as possible, with an accelerated sequence starting, by the way, in the early grades. There is no encouragement for acceleration, by the way, either. In fact, there is discouragement for acceleration. No one can understand any of this when you put it together. You may be right that it might help the very bottom, but why would that be the ceiling for all the rest of the students?
So, and I think the other thing about that is that, while it's, I think these people just believe that we need to have national standards testing and curriculum. A lot of other countries have it, but I think the thing that they're ignoring sort of the unique, legal, historical foundations of the country, and our most immediate neighbor to the north, Canada, is higher performing than the United States in K-12 education. Guess what? They don't have a U.S. Department of Education. They don't have national standards. They don't have a national test. They don't have national curriculum. It's all determined by their provinces. And so, while it's true that there are some countries, mostly smaller, pretty homogeneous countries, that are higher performing than this country and have national standards and tests, our most immediate neighbor, in fact the country that we probably share the most in common with Canada, does not. More questions?
Is it for Sandy or Jamie?
For Sandy or for Jamie?
I just have a general question. Are private schools, is this a public school or is this common across private schools as well? So for example, OLB, are they feeling?
Come on, Beth.
So I'm just wondering if private schools are feeling the nudge and the push as well as we are in a public school. I'm thinking I'm just trying to wrap my head around some things that were said this evening. So are they feeling the pressure? Do they have kids coming home crying because they can't add 8+10 in the new way that they're supposed to?
So the bulk of the students that are in Common Core are the public school students. Now, the thing is that the major architect of Common Core is a guy named David Coleman, and just a couple of years ago, he was appointed the president of the College Board. The College Board sets the SAT, and they set the AP, Advanced Placement Testing, too. And his stated goal is to align both the SAT and the AP to the Common Core, which, the early evidence is that will significantly dumb down both the SAT and the AP, too. So I think while right now it most directly impacts public school students, about half the archdiocese schools across the country have adopted Common Core, and I think that the goal of the people that are pushing for this are also to try to gather in so that the private or parochial schools, through the SAT and the AP, have to, if not align Common Core and adopt it, but they have to have some knowledge of it. I mean, they're really, this is a real across-the-board, one-size-fits-all approach to education.
Can I just make a comment too?
Just to follow up on that too, is that a lot of the private schools that I know of in the Worcester area, when they adopted the Common Core math, their math was way lower. So they thought it was an improvement. They didn't understand why they were doing it. When I challenged one board in particular why they adopted the Common Core math, they said, why not? It wasn't something that was thought out. They didn't understand what Common Core was. So we're finding that some of the smaller schools are doing it because most of the books now are being written. Common Core is all over it. It's a Common Core concept if you notice some of your kids' books coming home. Now
Everything is Common Core.
yeah, in some of the private schools, though, are still holding their own. There's a school, Sandy, I just went to visit the school in Natick that is a non-Common Core school. It's a Catholic independent school, and it's non-Common Core. Very small. And Sandy, Sandy knows, she's on the board too. So,
St. Benedict's, right.
yes, I'm just getting used to doing this. the basic curriculum is the classics. And I went to visit there because I wanted to understand it. It's very, very impressive. It's back with the classics, the writing.
Well, that was what they deliberately wanted, a classical curriculum, not a Common Core curriculum. And these are people who, children for the most part, came from parochial schools which had already adopted a Common Core curriculum, and they don't want it. They want a traditional classical Catholic curriculum, which is what they thought they were paying for to begin with.
So you're going to find that if you have your child in a private school, you need to ask. Say, are you using the Common Core? Or if you choose to pull your child out of public school to private school, you need to really do a lot of research because they try to really disguise it. And they use other words, but it's very clear once you start to see what they're doing, you know that if it's Common Core.
Could I add a few more words? Because even if people are homeschooling, and I've met a lot of homeschooling parents all across the country, even if they're going to private schools, sectarian or non-sectarian, we're still, with our tax money, paying for the public schools. And the public schools are being degraded by Common Core. And the question is whether we should allow the public schools to be degraded by Common Core, or whether there should be actions taken. I testified 2 nights ago, as did Professor Milgram, at the Orange County Board of Education in California, because the members of that county Board of Education, structured differently from Massachusetts, they want to plan a lawsuit against Sacramento for what they consider to be the imposition of standards that have removed local controls in terms of curriculum and instruction. There is a lawsuit going on in many other states right now. I don't have time to go into the details. About 30 states are trying to get out of Common Core. It was not a state-led venture, and they're finding that it's definitely not something that states can easily get out of. And people should be worrying about why it was made so difficult for states to get out of when there are so many protesting parents. And they are the ones mainly doing the protesting, even though the media seems to want to see somehow conservative or zany right-wing groups somehow doing the protest. When I go to speak at audiences, and the other night at Orange County, there was standing room only from parents. These are people who are young and have children in schools, most of them in K through 8, and they are the ones who are very upset with what's happening in their children's classrooms. But there has been no response by Secretary of Education Duncan, by anybody in the White House, by anybody in the USDE, by any commissioner of ed in any state, by any board of education about the problems that parents are facing as they look at what their children are studying. And one would have thought if this were an educational project, people would be concerned and responding and saying, let's have parents get together with X, Y, and Z, and let's figure out what we can do to remedy the chaos and the confusion in the public schools that is not due to simply the implementation of these standards, but is due to these very poor standards themselves. But there's nothing, there's no indication that anyone's having a problem except people who fly around in black helicopters or wear pointed black shoes.
Okay, Jamie? Okay.
So I guess I'd add 2 things, is that the implementation of this is not going to be immediate. What we know even from the experience with MCAS is that it's gradual. So it's not as though a switch is immediately hit and everything turns over to Common Core. I mean, we're 4 years into it. My daughter goes to school in Newton. She really had no evidences of it at all in first grade until the spring of her first grade. And she came home and she said, Daddy, what is a Common Core math journal? And it turns out, it's basically writing about math rather than actually doing equations, And that was the first evidence that I had heard about it or seen in the first year that she was in school. And I think it's going to be that way across the state. It's going to take time. And so it's never too late to pull out of it. I think you may hear from state legislators or from Board of Education members or what have you, oh, well, we're 4 years into it. It will take a long time. We know from previous experience that it takes a long time to convert over to these things. It may take a little bit less time because they're trying to push this pretty aggressively. And the other thing that I would note is that, and again, this is not a partisan comment, the governor-elect, Charlie Baker, in 2010, was one of the few people, I think maybe one of the only people, to testify in the State Board of Education against the adoption of Common Core. When he ran in 2014, it was a little bit, when he was asked about it, it was not a major campaign issue. He was a little bit less clear about it. What I would encourage you to do, whether it's Republicans or Democrats or governor-elect or whoever, is make your voices known to your public officials, your state legislators, your state reps, governor-elect, etc. If you're not school committees, if you're not happy about it, let them know about it, because that is really one of the best levers that you have to change the direction. And for Massachusetts, it's not too late. The fact is that the governor-elect could pull us out of the park testing. He could do it through an executive order, and it could actually be done very quickly. And
but I also add that in states like California and Massachusetts, all that is really necessary is for a local school board or a local school committee to vote to restore or adopt, re-adopt, whatever the technical term might be required, their own old standards, which were far superior in all ways to Common Core, because it's not just a question of ELA and math. It's also a question of science and history. Both California and Massachusetts had among the best sets of standards in all 4 major subjects. And right now, your state board in Massachusetts, our state board, is planning to adopt a set of science standards that's even worse than the math standards for Common Core. It does not include a set of standards for high school chemistry, and it renders high school physics unteachable. So if you care about the quality of a high school graduate education in Massachusetts, the best thing to do is to ask your school board, petition your school board, run for your school board, and just get the school committee to re-adopt or restore their old standards and to direct teachers to address those standards with whatever the classroom curriculum needs to be. When the state tries to impose its PARC test, the Common Core based test, that it plans to impose either next year, if it doesn't fall apart, or the year after that, those school committees can then refuse to impose a state-mandated test that contradicts the curriculum, a superior curriculum they have taught their kids. The state is going to protest and let it go to the state Supreme Court for adjudication. That's the only way you're going to be able to protect your high schools from the ravages of a dumbed-down Common Core curriculum that you will be told over and over again is demanding, superior, will make your kids college ready. It will do none of the above, but very few people will be in a position to say how it cannot do the above because they can't read the standards.
So why don't we get some more questions?
I have a lot of questions.
Up here.
Thank you. I thank you both, and for everybody that put this forum together. This is so helpful for me. I have so many questions. I have a lot of questions, but to start with the first, my question is more about the discouragement of acceleration of particular children who may excel in certain, perhaps, STEM curriculums. Is there an expectation for the parents that any AP courses and or the funding for those courses will dry up while the schools are focusing on the implementation and bringing the rest of the students up to standard so that perhaps their readiness for college will certainly be lessened, even more so than it will by just the standards themselves?
Could you repeat the question so I could understand it? I'm sorry, it didn't come through clearly. Could someone just give me the gist?
Yeah, it's basically how does this negatively impact accelerated students or higher performing students?
Oh, it's huge. That's what Professor Milgram has been saying. It's not for the top 30%. It will not help the middle 50%, and there's nothing that suggests it will actually do much for the bottom 30% at all. These standards are, first of all, in math and in ELA, poorly written. In math, they are almost uninterpretable in many cases, and this is why there's such a struggle with teachers to understand what to do in K through 8 math, plus the fact that they delay the teaching of algebra. But the English language standards are mainly skills. They carry no content. And what will happen in each classroom may be a function of whatever informational text the teacher chooses to introduce to address the 50%, approximately 50% quota that is being imposed by Common Core's English Language Arts reading standards. There's nothing that suggests these standards will help anybody, but it's clear they will damage the students at the top even more than they will damage the others. And this is what people who understand how to read high school math standards can see. They may be a little stronger in the elementary grades, but they leave kids worse off by the time they're in the high school grades. Weak Algebra 2 is what you end high school math with. What are you prepared to be able to do in college? Just ask yourself that. Who is that going to help? If they can even get students up to a weak Algebra 2, those that may have gotten up to an Algebra 1 in the past. We don't know yet where the cut score is going to be. But where is there any indication that they're going to help anybody?
Okay, we take another question.
So the other thing too is that as I say to audiences, if there's one thing that you take away tonight, realize the fact that Massachusetts now has the same academic expectations and standards as they do in Mississippi and Arkansas. I mean, in the same way that it'll adversely impact higher performing students in classrooms, it drags down high performing states. The goal here, for the architects of Common Core is uniformity. And so if Massachusetts, as we are right now, heading in a direction, we're on the PARCC testing with Arkansas and Mississippi and Louisiana, I mean, they're not going to set the pass rate, at the Massachusetts level because, all of these low-performing states will fail. They're going to set it at a lower level. So Massachusetts will still continue to do well under PARCC. It's just going to be under a lower standard and a lower set of expectations. So the analogy here is the classroom itself, but it's also writ large across the country. Let's get some more questions.
Got a couple more questions. Sandy, hold on.
Okay.
Do you want to bring the phone over here?
Do you want me to come over there?
Who do you have the question for?
It's a general question.
I have the general, we'll repeat it to her.
Okay. I'm an educator, elementary educator in Hopkinton. I live in Uxbridge. And my question is, right now Hopkinton is still with the old standards. As teachers, we're mandated to teach 60 minutes of math, 75 minutes of ELA each day, and 30 minutes of science each day. Our neighbor school, Holliston, it has adopted Common Core and the PARCC test. They've now moved science to a once-a-week special on par with art or music. And I didn't know if Common Core has mandated minutes per day of teaching each subject.
Excellent.
So I can answer that. I mean, it does not mandate minutes per day. I mean, I think the architects of Common Core and the advocates of Common Core say, oh, this is state-led, there's a lot of autonomy for each district to do what they want. But the problem is that what districts, and it's true of states, share in common will be on the test, right? And as a teacher, right, what's tested, that's ultimately what gets taught. And so while immediately it doesn't drive the amount of time that's going to be spent on a particular academic subject, as the teacher evaluations, because we haven't really talked about it, but part of the race to the top is is also a teacher evaluation model, is that once the teacher evaluations are then connected with the park, it will really be against teachers' best interest to to teach things that are not on the test, or to deviate. And so it seems like there's more wiggle room now, but the intent here is uniformity, and it will pinch more over time. I think that's probably the best way to answer it.
Could I also add that these are tests, unlike those in Massachusetts connected to MCAS, whose test items will not be available as a whole to all the teachers, parents, and students afterwards. A sample from each test may be made available, but no one knows whether this will be a representative sample or not, because they will be able to choose, the people who develop these tests, what items they will release for public consumption. And one does have to ask questions about test items that have never been reviewed by the state's teachers, by the state's board higher ed experts, by those who might be able to actually evaluate these items for their goodness. We know nothing, basically, about the construction of these tests. They're being developed in the darkness, so to speak, as opposed to those used for MCAS, because I know how they were reviewed, vetted, often revised and changed by Massachusetts teachers who met every year, and there were different teachers on these groups from year to year, and other teachers knew who was there. So teachers could have some confidence that their own colleagues, at least, in this state, knew what kinds of test items were going to be on MCAS. But you're not going to have that kind of security with Park or those who have to have smarter balance. That's not in Massachusetts at this point. But no one's going to be able to review and understand what is in those test items and why they're there.
Okay, we got a couple
There
of...
have been already negative reports on teachers' response to previews of these test items in a few other states. You don't see it in the news. They're just there.
Sandy, we got a couple more questions.
Sandy's touched on a very important piece of it. So the advocates of Common Core say, oh, well, Massachusetts, we have a seat at the table with the park testing. We're in, I think they start off with 25 states that are in the park test, and there's down to 9. It's actually dropping pretty dramatically. I mean, there's some question about whether park is going to survive or not. But people say, oh, well, Massachusetts has a seat at the table, but with the MCAS, we own the table, right? We had control. Our state legislators, our governor, our Board of Education, our Department of Education controlled the test. And that is not true. When you're in a consortium with 9 or whatever number of other states, you're just one among many. And the fact is that most of the other states in the park are really low-performing states. So let's get another question here.
My huge concern that has brought me here today is my child's privacy and my family's privacy with all of this data-driven. This touches me deeply. He's 8. He doesn't know if somebody's asking him an inappropriate question. He doesn't ask if filling out papers regarding his family life. He doesn't know that that's inappropriate. And I'm just concerned, are our children, their naivety, being taken advantage of? That is really what brought me here tonight. I've watched tons of videos, I've read hundreds and hundreds of pages, but what I have not seen addressed really is how do we protect our children from this data-driven system that is, it just seems so unhealthy. And I know as a parent also, we're trying to limit our screen time with our kids, limit TV, but this whole system seems to be pushing them in front of the screen all day. I mean, it can't be healthy for their minds, physically. I just see, these are the big things that brought me here tonight, because I have not yet really found good answers to those concerns. Could you help?
Sure. So we did a paper called, it's on our website, I'll give you my card. It's called Cogs in the Machine. It's a pretty long paper.
I
But
want to see a video.
Yeah, and-
Somebody referred to
Yeah,
that that I-
Jane, there's a woman named Jane Robbins. She's an attorney from Georgia who was one of the major authors on it, but it's called Cogs in the Machine, and it talks all about this data collection and all the privacy
But what can we
issues.
do? Is there something like we can do? Like,
Yeah.
can we, like, I send him with something tomorrow saying stop.
Right.
That he cannot, you cannot do this. Like, is there something we can do?
The most immediate thing you should do is go and talk with the superintendent or your school committee or your principal about, find out what data they are collecting on your kids. I mean, one of the things we've heard about this PARC test, even the pilot, is that they're embedding questions that are non-academic questions in the test itself. So they'll do a couple of academic questions, and then there'll be some question about their family, you know, what's the mail you get, or whatever. I mean, it seems, to be honest with you, I wish we didn't have to do this paper that we did, the Cogs in the Machine paper. I told my boss that. So I wish we didn't have to do this kind of paper. It's absurd. This idea of collecting 400 pieces of personally identifiable data on children that are really not related to their academic performance is bizarre to me. But the issue, I have to say, when we've gone around the country, in the Q&A time, I'd say like 60% of the questions are turning on this data collection issue because parents and moms across the country are horrified because really what's happened is that the U.S. Department of Education has, through this race to the top, they've created incentives for states to do these longitudinal data collecting and then turning it over to both the testing consortia and to the federal government. See, the feds are prohibited by law. There's laws called FERPA laws. They're prohibited from collecting these data. So what they've done is they've created an incentive for the states to do it, and then the states will turn it over to the feds. And it's real. I mean, in the same way they brushed aside the laws that prohibit them from pushing the national standards in testing and curriculum, they have also brushed aside these FERPA laws, these parental privacy laws. But again, I think that the first step would be to go to your school committee, your superintendent, and your principal and find out what they're doing in that regard. But then I'd also encourage you to read the paper or take a look at the paper, the Cogs in the Machine paper, and also there's a video. Jane Robbins, who was one of the co-authors, you just do a Google search for, Jane Robbins and, data collection, and the video will pop up. It's gotten like 40,000 views in the last year or so. It's amazing. And she kind of maps it out with a lot more precision and detail than I could. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but...
Somewhat. I thought I read, like, there's this, I saw somewhere that there was, like, sort of the Freedom of Information Act refers to something like that, that we can have access to our children's files.
Yes.
We can see what is in them, what data has been collected. We can make changes that we see fit. We can correct things. We can delete things.
Right.
But what I question is, last year, I didn't know I didn't know to question these things. Even I think some things at the beginning of the year, I didn't know to question them. Did I inadvertently sign consent to do something that now I'm aware when I wasn't? It's like.
So I would ask your school department because they work for you. You pay your taxes, pay for their.
Me too.
And
I just learned that today watching the video, hearing actually.
But that's what I would do. I would reach out
Donna.
to them. You had a question?
No.
No. Okay.
Thank you.
Hi, this is back for Sandy, connecting to what she had just said. Do you want me to?
Yeah, I want you to talk into the, Sandy.
Yeah, I'm here, but I don't know what the question.
Okay, can you hear the question now?
But I didn't hear those questions
Okay.
that you want me to answer.
So the question is, you had mentioned that teachers aren't able to have access to the test, and obviously a test isn't an end product, it's designed to inform education. If we are unable to analyze how children are performing, and how is this supposed to inform education, and what service is it actually providing?
Oh, they're excellent questions. We don't know the answers to them. Those are the questions that need to be raised over and over again. If the test data are to go to Washington, D.C., to the Department of Ed, how will they inform instruction? I don't know. I haven't seen anything or read anything. Have you been told by your superintendent, your curriculum specialist, how the information from the test results will be made useful to you as a teacher? I mean, you're in the trenches, you're in the first line. Have you been told how they will help you?
my district hasn't adopted Common Core, but we have crunched MCAS data for years, and I don't understand
Well,
how.
the MCAS, you would see,
Right.
and you would get individual reports on how many students in a school didn't pass X item and how many didn't pass Y item. That is all I knew from a Department of Education perspective. And if these teachers were told about what items their students, they would get a profile of what items their students missed or didn't miss. And then those teachers who taught writing would be able to go to rubrics that would help them see better models for writing. So I don't know what you're going to get with Common Core because no one has described what kind of information is to be made available from computer-based tests.
So then who is this information truly serving? Because it's not serving teachers in order
That's right.
Okay.
It's not serving teachers so far as we know. That's a question that has to be raised at the school level. Who is going to be the user of this information and what will they do with it? We are told that it is to help somebody decide whether a student is on track to become college ready.
Okay, we got another question. That was good.
I don't know.
Another question, because we have about another 5 minutes, so another question, okay.
I just have a general question. I'm an educator in Worcester, but I live in Uxbridge. And I know that in Uxbridge, they're still using the MCAS this year, but some schools in Worcester are using the PARC. So I just wanted to address the issue, if you can answer on how parents can opt their children out of these tests.
I know that question because I was on the Worcester School Committee. So, one of the things you can do is, first of all, it's in the second year of pilot, so there is it's told, you don't have to take the test. So, we have on our website, Common Core Forum, a form, generic form that you can fill out, and you can bring it to your principal at your school and just hand it to them and say, I refuse to have my child take this test. You have to use the language refuse, and that's why we put it on the form. And the superintendent of Worcester last spring did respect that. So Superintendent Boone did respect that. This year, they're trying to work that in with, they brought it up a couple times. So I am sure that she will probably respect it once again, hoping that there won't be a large majority of students. We have, in Worcester though, we have a large percentage of English language speakers and as a second language, so we do have a difficulty relaying the facts to the parents. So if you do not want your child to take the PARC test, you can go to our website, download the form, and just hand it in, and you'll have no problem.
Just a quick question on that. Are there consequences for the student that would maybe reflect detrimentally on their record if, as a parent, I opt them out? Will they not be eligible for certain services or, I don't know, perhaps other options? For services.
I've heard that question before, and parents say that if they don't do something, like if they didn't do the MCAS, they wouldn't be eligible for certain.
I'm sorry, what is the question to me? I'm sorry.
The question, Sandy, is if they opt their child out of the PARC testing this year, will they be denied services?
They should not be. That is something that may be threatened, but there is nothing in the statutes for any state that suggests that if students are opted out of a state-mandated test, there would be any penalty at all. In fact, this should be the prerogative of a local school committee discussion and vote. Penalties cannot be set by a State Department of Education. They are not accountable. Teachers are hired and fired by local school committees in this state, and in all other states they're hired and fired by local school boards, not state departments of ed. If students are opted out, it is the local school committee or board that has to decide whether they should be given an alternative teaching session on the day that they are opted out of a test, whether it should be counted for attendance, truancy, whatever. These are not policies that administrators should be making up out of their heads because they have been told to do something drastic to intimidate parents. And this is what parents are picking up all over the country.
Okay, we have another
I don't
question.
know what's going to happen here if people do that, but there should be no penalties because there's none specified in the statutes.
Question we don't want to back to, okay.
All right, and I'm Sandy, right. Sandy, I'm going to read this email that we received the past 2 days here in the Uxbridge community, and then afterwards I'm going to mention who the author was. You may not have seen it. Dear parents and residents, I am writing to remind you the community forum to discuss Common Core standards has been scheduled for December 1st in Uxbridge High School auditorium. This forum has been scheduled per request of parents, and opportunities will be made available after 8 o'clock to speak with educators. Our focus will be to discuss the efforts of the district to implement Common Core standards since they were drafted in 2010, and what we are doing to assist educators, parents, and students to adapt to the state frameworks. We recognize that a second forum has been scheduled for November 19th to discuss the political elements of Common Core. Unfortunately, many Uxbridge public school officials and educators are unable to attend the second forum due to previous scheduled commitments. If you are interested in addressing political aspects of the Common Core, please connect with your school committee representatives to address this concern. Depending on the nature of the concerns, the issue could be added as a school committee agenda item at an upcoming meeting. Thank you for your attention. Sincerely, Kevin Carney, Superintendent of Schools. Sandy, what are your thoughts on that?
I, first of all, would suggest that it sounds like a form letter that was given to him and probably a lot of other superintendents to deal with meetings that are not under the control of the Department of Ed or the administration in a local school district. It certainly isn't coming from the school committee. It seems to be coming from your superintendent, as I listened to what you read. And the fact that he would call the meeting tonight a political one without explaining why it's political and why the one that they would hold on December 1st is an educational one, when it's clear that I have more educational credentials in reading and language arts and literature studies than probably almost anyone they might have at the December 1st meeting. It's something they would need to explain. But it is clearly an attempt to intimidate the parents, to discourage them from coming to a meeting like tonight because they may hear information that superintendents don't have the facts to answer with.
Okay, and the other thing, just to add to that, this is why it is so important to run for your local school boards. So in May, when you have your elections, it's time to run. It's time to run. Step up to the plate, parents, and run, because this is what it's about. It's about you having control over your child's education.
Yeah, so what if I could just comment on that? I mean, first of all, I back 20-some odd years ago worked for several superintendents of schools. They are some of the most political people you are going to interact with in your entire life. So the notion that what they do, or the working of school districts, or the interaction between superintendents and school committees and teacher unions isn't political is ridiculous. I think you've been able to hear tonight that this is not some kind of political rally. We've tried to be as objective as possible, mapping out the research, the independent research that we have done on this topic. What is clear is that the 3 evaluations that were relied upon by the Commissioner of Education in 2010 for the adoption of Common Core, all 3 of those, the Fordham Institutes, the Mass Business Alliance for Education, and Achieving, they were all funded by the Gates Foundation. They were funded by the same people who paid for the development of the standards. I mean, it's a little bit like being judge and jury in their own case. And so the notion that this that only they are going to be able to provide you the educational or sort of independent view of this is just, it doesn't pass the smell test. I mean, and I think what we've seen, and Donna can certainly validate this, we have had dozens of these kinds of forums all over Massachusetts, and every single one of them, the local superintendent, the school committee generally, if someone from the Department of Education has been asked to participate, to debate the topic, and with very, very few exceptions, they will not do it. And it gets back to what I was saying earlier. The fundamental function of public school education in this democracy is to educate children for citizenship. And if the people that are making the rules are either violating the laws or are unwilling or unable to participate in public forums, having the free exchange of ideas and debating the ideas and policy that impact our children, that's horrendous. You know, and so that would be my comment on it. We have tried to be very, very earnest and kind of direct and honest about what it is, the work that we have done. And as Sandy pointed out, there isn't anybody who has higher level of credibility on the topic of English and math standards in this country than Sandy Stotsky and Jim Milgram. I mean, even the advocates of it, of Common Core, acknowledge the high level of expertise that she and others that have done her research have on the topic.
We've got a question back there.
I didn't probably speak loud enough. I am on the school committee. No ramifications if you adopted out last year, and this year we aren't having it. My questions are, what are the repercussions since Massachusetts took Race to the Top money if we opted out? The second one is that as far as not offering a STEM pathway, is that firm that you couldn't offer it, or do schools have the option to offer a second math pathway that could include STEM? And let's see here. And then I guess in reference, in reference to the email, Paul, that you read, I think when I just read it again, and after you read it, I think what he's saying is this is a political forum in that it's a pro and con, and that his is going to be, here's what we're doing, not the good and bad, but here's how it's being implemented in the district. And I think, in all fairness, I think that's what that email was trying to say. So we have implications, and then where the integrated math, I actually kind of get why they would do that, but would our school or our district states be able to offer a second pathway in math?
So I'll answer the question about Race to the Top, and then maybe Sandy can answer the question about STEM. So in 2010, Massachusetts participated in, actually 2009, 2010, Massachusetts participated in Race to the Top. The fact is that they were rushing to get Common Core finished so that they could embed the adoption of into Race to the Top. In the first round Race to the Top, Massachusetts came in 13 out of 16 states. So even though we were #1 in the country and internationally competitive, in the first round we did not actually adopt Common Core, and we came in 13th out of 16. In the second round, we really only changed one thing in our application. Guess what that was? Adopting Common Core. And guess what we were? #1. It tells you how badly they had to have Massachusetts adopt. Because if Massachusetts adopted, then all the other states couldn't resist, right? I mean, we're the best in the country and internationally competitive, that if you put that trophy up on the mantelpiece, all the others have to fall in line. In exchange for adoption, we got, wait one sec, Sandy. We had $250 million, which seems like a lot of money, and it is a lot of money. But the fact is we're spending $9 billion annually at the state and local level here in Massachusetts. And that $250 million is $250 million over 4 years. So it ends up being about 33 cents per kid per day.
Did we run out of it? We ran out of it.
And it's gone.
It's gone, yeah.
That was 4 years ago.
It was 2010 to
so
14.
it's completely gone. And the fact is that so the U.S. Department of Education can't come back and get their money.
They cannot?
They cannot.
Okay.
What they can try to do, and they've done this with Oklahoma, who has pulled out of Common Core, is that they can threaten to withhold a waiver to the No Child Left Behind law. So there's the U.S. Secretary of Education is permitted to provide a waiver from certain provisions of the No Child Left Behind law. What the U.S. Secretary of Education is not permitted to do is add additional conditions to that waiver that have not been authorized by Congress, which is precisely what the Secretary of Education has done in the states that have tried to pull out. And guess what the conditions are? You have to align with Common Core, and you've got to do the national testing. So they're trying to use these sort of bureaucratic, sticks to kind of keep people in line. But in terms of the money's gone, and it's been spent. And it, frankly,
my concern was, simply what were the, did you have to pay it back?
So, but that's an issue.
Or would they withhold money?
But it is outside the law. The No Child Left Behind law does not have any conditions about adopting national standards or testing or Common Core in it. This U.S. Secretary of Education just added those on, just tacked them on. No approval from Congress to do that. You've just done that. That's kind of lawless. But those are the kinds of, they're kind of bureaucratic measures. They threaten to withhold Title I federal reading money to states that pull out. I mean, there's all these kind of, this is what DC does. They're great on compliance and spending other people's money. They're not so great on, actually boosting student achievement. So, and then Sandy can tell you a little bit about what the impact will be for STEM and a possible other pipeline to go beyond Common Core if a school district wants to.
California has in there that you could choose the integrated, you could choose your traditional method. You had the option to do.
Yeah, let me answer that one because it appears that even though Common Core is neutral on whether you have an integrated or single subject sequence in math, most states or most superintendents seem to be going with the advice they have received, which is to install or implement only the integrated approach, which is, by the way, easier than the single subject approach, and it's much easier to see what is missing when you look at single subject approaches, what is in an Algebra 1 approach to Euclidean geometry or an Algebra 2, and whether there's even a pre-calculus course available. It's much harder to detect unless you know how to read the topics and understand what needs to precede them and not what needs to come after them, because mathematics as a discipline is so skill sequence hierarchical in nature in terms of its structure. And this is something you need to listen to mathematicians explain. And this is what someone like Professor Milgram will explain, or any of your mathematicians at universities here in the Boston area. But I would like to get back to what you were asking about earlier, because what we are seeing, I think, including the letter that was read out loud before from your superintendent, is an attempt to use a strategy that we know as calling the pot calling the kettle black. You accuse other people of being political, but you're pure at heart. You're just educational. It is very difficult, I understand, for parents and others to truly understand what is happening to our school curriculum, because most of us for hundreds of years have always trusted our teachers, our school administrators, and even other educators all the way up the line. And this is of a different phenomenon, a different nature than we've ever had before in this country. And it's almost as if they're relying on the trustingness, the gullibility of parents. And I've seen this particularly in California, where parents didn't even want to question what was going on when their own children were coming home hurt, crying, tired, not wanting to go to school each day, children who had always liked school and had done well in school, and they didn't want to ask what was going on with the curriculum. Massachusetts seems to have more aggressive parents in a sense, which is healthier. But the problem is that we don't ask why these actions are taking place at all in a state that was doing better than all other states in this country and could have been a model, which it wasn't for Common Core. David Coleman now claims that he used Massachusetts and maybe California, maybe Georgia for models for his ELA standards. But I know them by heart because I advised all of these states after we developed the first class standards we had in Massachusetts. Common Core standards bear no resemblance to the first class standards we had in Massachusetts. Yet that is what they are resorting to try to give some legitimacy to what they've come up with. But they cannot get the approval of higher ed folks. ELA, there isn't one literary scholar who has come out for Common Core English Language Arts literature standards, not one. I mean, you have to ask yourself, what's going on? Where are these teachers who are saying they find students gaining deeper insight or being more willing to be engaged, blah, blah, blah. Group learning, have you heard about all the group learning projects taking place? I am absolutely overwhelmed by the implementation of Common Core with something called cooperative learning, group learning, which, by the way, isn't in the Common Core standards, but is being promoted as if this is what Common Core wants, because it fits some larger rubric called collaborative skill development. There are peculiar things going on, and alert parents had better make sure that school time is being used as learning time, not for something else.
Thank you.
I
Thank you.
will stop at this point.
Okay. Okay, you're going to stop? Are you going to get off the phone? Or you? I think we're
No,
almost
I'll
done.
just stop talking.
Okay.
I'll answer any more
Okay.
questions.
All right. Thank you. That was a great question.
My question is simple. I have a list of questions that I'm not going to go over here, but where can we email questions, or is there any way we can get information after the meeting?
Oh, sure. Sandy?
Oh,
Well,
okay. Sandy,
I have,
go ahead.
let me give you a few places that I can recommend, and then you people can come in with some others. But I have tried to make all my testimony and all my videotaped remarks and panel participations available on my homepage at the University of Arkansas. And that can be easily accessed simply by Googling Sandra Stofsky, Arkansas. The first thing you will pick up will be my homepage at the University of Arkansas. It's got a good firewall. It's a very secure site. And I just put all of my testimony or the videotapes or YouTubes that people make from unedited remarks at Common Core Forum. Everything is there for you to find, read if you want to. Month by month, I've got it just organized chronologically, that's all. That is probably the best place for finding out in general. James Milgram, the mathematician at Stanford, also has a website. I can't give you the website URL, but you can Google it. And he is always interested in hearing from parents or teachers about the mathematical problems, the test items or problems or lessons that their kids are giving, because he has a very deep interest in what is happening in K-12. Remember, he helped to write California's K-12 math standards with 3 other mathematicians at Stanford. They had been asked by the Board of Ed and the governor at that time when there was a math wars going on in California. So he knows the nature of highly competitive or internationally benchmarked standards in K-12. But he is the one to answer math questions, not me. I'll stop here.
I'm going to end the forum now. We went a little over time. I want to thank the host parents that invited us here, Sue and Tina, and there's another group of parents too. And I want to thank our 2 speakers, Jamie Gass, Sandra Stosky, for participating in this forum. I hope we answered a good majority of your questions. And as always, Jamie gave out his card, Sandra gave you some website. You can go to Common Core Forum and reach myself, or you can go to our Facebook page, Common Core Forum, and we have a collaboration of parents and teachers and school committee members that participate openly and discuss different things that are happening in the state. Pioneerinstitute.org, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you again, and have a good night.